You're an adult now. Stop depending on your parents. You're only living here because you don't pay rent. Isn't it pathetic? We won't put up with it any longer. Leave immediately." Michael's voice was icy and cutting. "They label me as unemployed just because I work from home, a situation I didn't choose. They've put my mother in a nursing home, and I can't handle it anymore." Karen chuckled, her gaze lingering on me with an unsettling curiosity. I couldn't fathom what was so amusing. "My name is Rachel. Until recently, I enjoyed tranquil days at my parents' home. The warmth of family gatherings was always a source of comfort. But everything changed one day due to an accident. My mother now relies on a wheelchair to go outside and needs a walker to move around the house. Despite the hardship, I've always admired her resilience in accepting this new reality. My father, Richard, had always been the steadfast pillar of our family. Despite his advancing age, he remained unwaveringly dependable, especially in supporting my mother. That's why I chose to stay home all this time to assist them. But everything changed abruptly when my father suffered a fatal heart attack. From that moment, our home fell into an even deeper silence. In that oppressive quiet, I felt lost and unsure of how to move forward. The news of his sudden death was a staggering blow to our family. My mother, Linda, was overwhelmed with grief, her sorrow evident as she wept uncontrollably until the funeral. Watching her in such anguish was heart-wrenching. As the eldest daughter, I was expected to fulfill the role of chief mourner, though traditionally it is the eldest son, Stephen, who would take on this responsibility. He dismissed the duty with a casual, "Let Rachel handle it," and avoided the task altogether. On the day of the funeral, I was too consumed by my responsibilities to grieve openly until my father's cremation. It was only at the crematorium, faced with the harsh reality, that I allowed my tears to flow freely. Lisa, Stephen's wife, observed my tears with a cold gaze and said, "Aren't you ashamed of crying so much as an adult?" Michael echoed her sentiment, adding, "It's pitiful. I wish you'd compose yourself." Despite their harsh words, I took my mother's wheelchair and guided her to a quieter corner away from the crowd. We held hands, sharing stories of my father, his warm smile, and the cherished moments we spent together. In that intimate space, Linda and I resolved, from now on, it will be just the two of us. We'll combine our strengths and look forward together. After the funeral, Michael and Lisa departed without a word. I was surprised by their early departure, especially given the significance of our father's funeral. His sudden death had shifted the dynamics within our family. Stephen, in particular, seemed distant, but my mother reassured me, everyone grieves in their own way. Stephen might be mourning in his own way. I took her words to heart and tried to keep my emotions in check. After that, life settled into a quiet routine for my mother and me. I worked from home as a freelance programmer, though my parents never fully understood the nature of my job. They probably assumed I was working diligently, given my regular contributions to the household finances. Balancing my programming work with household chores and caring for my mother proved challenging. With my father gone, I now bore the brunt of managing the household and looking after my mother, all while maintaining my job. Adding to the strain was the debt my father had incurred as a co-signer for a friend who had disappeared, leaving us to face the financial burden. Even in retirement, my father had taken on part-time work to repay the debt, but with his passing, that responsibility fell to me. Every day was a struggle with debt collectors visiting monthly and the pressure of approaching repayment deadlines. Managing the house, working, and dealing with these financial obligations was more demanding than I had anticipated. Yet I was determined not to burden my mother with my stress. Despite my exhaustion, I made sure to remain cheerful and supportive around her. Each time Michael visited, it felt like all my efforts were undone. Though his home is about an hour's drive away, he made the trip occasionally to check on Mom. However, his visits always seemed to come with criticism of my work. Still fixated on that keyboard job, he would sneer at my commitment to freelancing. "I've told you before, I'm making a decent living as a freelancer. Whether you approve or not, I'm charting my own course. Freelancing, honestly, just sounds like you're bragging," he would sarcastically remark. Michael was always seen as the ideal son, admired by everyone. Growing up, I was frequently compared to him, often just seen as Michael's sister. True to form, his visit began with petty criticism, but today he seemed to have something more serious to discuss with Mom. After a brief conversation, he quickly moved to her room. I was curious and discreetly watched what was unfolding. Inside, Michael, looking somewhat displeased, was expressing his concerns about my work. Isn't it because you've coddled Rachel that she hasn't taken on a proper job? Michael's voice was laced with clear dissatisfaction. Our mother, with a resigned expression, took a deep breath and replied, I may not fully understand the details of what Rachel does, but I believe she's chosen her own path and is giving it her best. If she's content with it, that's what matters to me. Michael's displeasure was evident. But isn't it partly your fault that Rachel's always stuck at home? For her sake, maybe it's time you consider moving to a senior living facility. At that moment, I felt a strong urge to defend my mother and assert my own choices. I chose freelancing for its flexibility and my passion for programming. Being able to support and spend time with my mother were important factors, but they were not the sole reasons. Without thinking, I opened the door and walked toward my mother, ready to confront the situation. I want you to know, Mom, that I didn't choose this path because of you. I chose this job because it's the right fit for me, I said firmly. Linda smiled, her eyes full of appreciation. I know you didn't choose this just for me, Rachel. Catching Michael's surprised expression out of the corner of my eye, I continued, I've never seen you as a burden, Mom. My mother responded by gently squeezing my hand, and in that moment, I felt our connection strengthen more than ever. Rachel, thank you. I'm deeply grateful for all the care you've given me, but I wish you could have more time for yourself. Her words made tears well up in my eyes. Rachel, you're an adult. You should be exploring the world beyond this house. There's no need to be confined here, Michael said, his tone stern yet tinged with concern. After escorting me out of the room, he started discussing moving our mother to a senior home. Before long, the decision was made for her to relocate. The house felt unbearably quiet and empty compared to the days when our family was together. When I visited Mom at the senior home, I found some relief in seeing her enjoy her new friendships. Still, I couldn't shake the frustration of Michael making such a significant decision without consulting me. One day, I received an unexpected call from Michael. Keep Sunday free, he ordered abruptly before hanging up. His overbearing attitude was becoming too much for me. On Sunday morning, Michael and his wife, Karen, showed up at my door. As soon as they entered my room, Michael made a surprising proposal. Don't you think this house is a bit too large for you, Rachel? Karen added with a smile. Actually, we're considering moving in here. Could you find somewhere else to stay? I was stunned and could only manage a stunned, what? Michael continued, you've been depending on our parents even as an adult. You stay here because you don't pay rent, and that's not acceptable. You need to move out. Karen stood beside him, wearing a smirk. A surge of emotions welled up inside me, but I managed to reply, fine, I'll move out. But from now on, stay out of my affairs. In response, Michael proposed, maybe it's time to sever our sibling ties. It could be a fresh start for both of us, don't you think? I nodded in agreement, saying, that sounds fine to me. Soon after, I began searching for a new place and quickly found an apartment that I liked. The move was swift since I didn't have much to pack. The new apartment was perfect for solo living, bright, well-ventilated, and very comfortable. The pressure I felt in the large house back home gradually lifted in this new setting. To my surprise, I quickly found myself enjoying this new phase of my life. Even shopping at the nearby small supermarket became a pleasure. This fresh start brought new discoveries and a sense of hope. On a sunny day about a month later, I received an unexpected call from Michael, who had previously claimed we were no longer in contact. His voice carried an edge of urgency. Rachel, is it true that Dad left behind debts? It dawned on me that I hadn't informed Michael about the debts. For me, dealing with them had become a routine part of life, and I hadn't considered it noteworthy. Why didn't you mention this earlier? The whole neighborhood is buzzing with rumors. Karen's too scared to even go outside. How have you managed to keep those intimidating debt collectors at bay? Michael asked. I replied calmly, it's straightforward. I've been making the payments every month. Really? The collectors are saying the amount is $1,000 a month. How have you been able to cover that? Well, it was tight, but my freelance work was doing well, so I managed. I worked hard to balance both the debt repayments and our household expenses, I explained. Michael, on the other hand, had a steady job at a large company but hadn't seen much career advancement or salary increase. I suspected that my income might be higher than his, and it seemed I was correct. Michael sounded desperate. Honestly, $11,000 is a bit too much for me. Can you help me out? He pleaded. I responded coolly, recalling our previous agreement. Remember, we severed our sibling ties. You'll need to discuss this with Karen and handle your own finances. Without waiting for a reply, I ended the call. Michael's calls didn't stop, and I had a sinking feeling that something significant had happened. The next morning, the doorbell rang. Peering through the peephole, I saw Michael and Karen, looking quite remorseful and holding the gift. Likely an apology. They had found my new address through Mom and had come over. I didn't open the door but spoke through the intercom. What brings you here? Tears welled up in Michael's eyes as he pleaded. I'm truly, deeply sorry. I don't have anyone else to turn to. Please help me. Karen stood beside him, her head bowed in apology. It was clear that Michael had made some poor investments and lost a substantial amount of money. Their plan had been to take over the family home, reduce living expenses, and use her father's inheritance to repay the debts. The entire scheme to move Mom to a nursing home and force me out of the house was Michael's idea. But instead of finding an inheritance, all they uncovered was a massive debt. I thought we'd be able to claim the house and pay off the debts with Dad's inheritance. I had no idea he left behind so much debt, he said, his voice trembling with emotion. Remember, we agreed to sever our sibling ties. We're no longer family, I said coldly, dismissing them. If you continue to bother me, I'll have to involve the police. Their devastated expressions were evident, but their problems were no longer my concern. Later, while walking near my old home, I noticed that it was up for sale. Surprised, I spoke with a neighbor who mentioned ongoing disputes between Michael, Karen, and the debt collectors. It seemed they had vanished suddenly, likely due to their financial troubles. I hoped they found some measure of happiness wherever they ended up. Meanwhile, my own life was fulfilling. My work was busy and I enjoyed various delightful events, especially outings with friends from the tennis club and wonderful dates with a special someone I met there. I excitedly shared the news with Mom, saying, Mom, I've met someone. She beamed with happiness and said, as long as you're happy, I am too. Her words filled my heart with joy. I eagerly anticipate the future, walking alongside the person I've chosen to share my life with. The road ahead looks bright and full of promise. My nickname is unpatriotic, and it's a horrible name to be called. But it must be a misunderstanding. That's all. The woman in front of me, struggling to find the right words, is my despised mother-in-law, Susan. Just minutes ago, Susan told me to leave the store, and I walked out in tears. After persistent calls from both Thomas and Susan, I returned to the store, where Susan, normally so quick to belittle me, looked more panicked than ever. She had just loudly told me to leave, calling me a stranger. What did she mean by that? I need an explanation. My name is Caroline, a 32-year-old office worker. I have been married to Thomas for 4 years, but we don't have any children yet. My life changed dramatically after the death of Thomas's father, Kingston. We were living in another state at the time. Kingston's sudden heart attack was a shock, and at his funeral, Thomas's uncle said to him, "You're the youngest and the only son. You'll return home eventually, right? Make sure Mom feels at ease." A few months after Kingston's death, Thomas announced that he had transferred to an office near home. He already made the decision and reported it to me afterward. I protested, "Why would you decide something so important without consulting me?" To which Thomas replied, "I thought you'd object." "Sorry, Caroline," Thomas said. "I know you don't get along with my mom. It's true, I dislike Susan, and she dislikes me even more. When we lived out of state, we only visited during long vacations due to work while Susan nagged, 'Why can't you come at least once a month? It's not like you live overseas. Nancy visits twice a week, you know.'" Nancy and Tracy, Thomas's older sisters, live close to their parents. Of course, Nancy can visit twice a week if she lives nearby. Thomas defended me, saying, "Don't compare us to Nancy. We have work and flying back every time is costly." Kingston tried to mediate, so our relationship with Susan was strained but manageable. Susan's primary issue with me seems to be children. I remember last summer's visit vividly when she asked, "Why don't you have children yet?" She looked pointedly at my stomach and added, "Sorry, but Nancy doesn't have any children either. Both Nancy and Tracy married before me and also don't have children. I thought she should focus on her own daughters rather than criticize me." But Susan said, "Nancy's married off, but you're different. As a daughter-in-law, you're expected to provide a proper heir." Her outdated remarks always frustrated me. Moreover, she told me, with the low birth rate nowadays, it's better to have more children for society. You don't want to be unpatriotic, do you? Unpatriotic, I thought. Who even uses such a word? Susan's comments were strange and shocking. However, when I heard that Susan was ill, even Thomas seemed concerned, leading to our recent actions. Naturally, I was conflicted. Following Thomas meant quitting my job and, more importantly, dealing with increased interactions with Susan. I even considered asking Thomas to go alone. But then I saw a social media post from a friend whose husband had cheated on her during a business trip. After much deliberation, I decided to go with Thomas, reasoning that we wouldn't be living together anyway. Susan seemed genuinely delighted by my decision. 2 weeks later, Susan invited me for tea at her place. It was the first time I'd accepted such an unwelcome invitation, but I couldn't ignore it. When I arrived at the in-laws' house, Susan and Nancy greeted me. Seeing my two least favorite people, I already wanted to leave. Caroline, long time no see. Why haven't you visited since moving here? Nancy asked, her tone dripping with malice. Susan sighed. Caroline, I was so happy you decided to move here, but it seems I was mistaken. You dislike me, don't you? I considered saying, yes, I do, just to seek her reaction, but of course I couldn't. I don't dislike you, it's just that I've been feeling unwell due to the new environment, I said, which was true. I had been resting at home due to fatigue, and Thomas hadn't mentioned anything about the visit. Why was I called here today, just to hear their nasty comments? Susan accuses me of disliking her, but isn't it the other way around? How can we possibly get along under these circumstances? Nancy snapped. How can you speak to mother-in-law like that? Apologize to her. Say you're sorry. I thought Susan would react with anger, but her response was unexpected. You're right, I have been mean. I'm sorry, Caroline. I'm sorry about the child comments too. I was being nosy. I braced myself for a scolding, expecting some underlying malice, but there was none. Even Nancy looked surprised. All I wanted was to hold a grandchild. Nancy's husband was infertile, and Tracy seemed to have fertility issues, so I hoped Thomas and I would be able to provide that joy. Despite knowing about Nancy and Tracy's struggles, Susan had unfairly taken her frustrations out on me. Thomas and I have discussed having children and are considering it, so please, just leave us be for now. I bowed my head slightly, but I suppose I still had a conscience. I'm sorry, I said, but do visit us sometimes, Susan replied. After that, Susan and Nancy started watching TV and having tea as if the earlier awkwardness had never happened. I like this announcer, she's so energetic and bright, Susan said, referring to her favorite local female announcer. I glanced at the TV, feeling a twinge of regret. Maybe if I had been more outgoing, things could have been different with Susan and her family. It was a silly thought, but I was glad to have shared my feelings today. Perhaps things could improve. However, my hopes were quickly dashed. That night, Thomas came home and immediately started yelling. I heard from Mom that you said you have no intention of getting along. Are you saying Mom was crying? I was bewildered. Why was Thomas reacting this way? After our conversation, he had waved goodbye with a smile, and now he seemed to be accusing me of something. Look, Thomas, it's a misunderstanding on Susan's part. I tried to explain. I told her I don't know how to be friends under these circumstances. You know about my relationship with Susan. How does that turn into me not wanting to be friends? I'm beyond astonished now. I'm just scared. Thomas completely believes Susan's version of events. His earlier smile now seems like a lie. I don't know what to do. I tried to explain, but Thomas didn't seem convinced. Then I received a message from Nancy. You were a bit cheeky with Mom. After all the effort of moving here, didn't you come prepared? If you're following me here, then you should be a bit more patient. Thomas looked at me as if to say, she should be more patient. Yes, I moved here for Thomas, but it was because I care about him, not just to appease Susan and Nancy. I wanted to be with him, and that was my priority. I looked straight into Thomas's eyes and said, but it's clear that Susan and the others might never like me. Maybe you should consider marrying someone Susan approves of. The word divorce slipped out before I could stop it, and for the first time, Thomas looked genuinely panicked. Wait, hold on. How do we jump to divorce? I just want you to get along better with my family. He didn't understand that his family might never accept me, which baffled me. It seemed Thomas didn't want a divorce, as the next day, he came home late from work. I talked to Mom, he said. She said it was a misunderstanding and apologized. What a fuss. He also mentioned that it was almost Susan's birthday. Thomas suggested, how about celebrating Susan's birthday at a fancy restaurant? If we say it was your idea, maybe Mom's view of you will change. He presented it as a great plan, but I suspected that Susan's twisted nature wouldn't make her genuinely pleased with such a gesture. Still, I agreed to handle the restaurant reservation and invited Nancy and others too. Make it for 7, I said. Thomas agreed, but I was filled with unease. As Susan's birthday approached, Thomas had been acting strangely for about a week, unusually cold and responding to my attempts at conversation with vague, disinterested answers. It felt very unpleasant. I wondered if something was wrong at work, but I would soon find out the real issue. When we arrived at the restaurant, Susan, Nancy, and their spouses were already there. Thomas and I were shown to our table, and a worker glanced at us questioningly, making me feel uneasy. "Happy birthday, Susan," I said, but Susan didn't even look our way. Instead, she addressed the group. "Thank you all for coming today. I'm blessed to be celebrated by my family." Her deliberate disregard felt like an insult. Nancy looked puzzled. "Ha! I thought today was a family gathering," she said, glancing at me briefly. Tracy looked over worriedly. I realized then, I was being completely ignored. If that was the case, I'd simply ignore them in return and leave early. Just as I thought this, a worker approached our table awkwardly. "I'm terribly sorry, but the reservation was for 6 people today." "I distinctly reserved for 7, I said. "Was there a mistake?" "No, it should be for 7, I insisted. That's what I told them over the phone. "Oh yes, but about a week ago we received a call to change the number to 6 from a gentleman," the worker explained. I was confused and looked at Thomas in disbelief. Thomas said, "Yes, please service for 6. Everyone's here now." I was stunned. "What?" I exclaimed. Thomas turned to me, accusingly. "I heard from Mom's side that you've been bad-mouthing our family a lot, saying I don't earn enough, and that I'm insensitive. You really had a lot to say, huh?" It seemed that a week ago, when Thomas contacted Susan about the reservation, she filled his head with all sorts of lies. Foolish Thomas, without a doubt, believed her. Angry, he had called the restaurant, pretending to be me, and changed the reservation from 7 to 6. The restaurant, hearing the same last name, didn't question it. How could he be so easily deceived in such a short time? Was he really that gullible? With this realization, I felt that there was no point in me being there. Why was I even invited? When I confronted Thomas, demanding that he apologize to everyone present and reflect on his actions, Thomas did the unexpected. He insisted that I apologize to my in-laws and then go home alone to think things over. Naturally, I refused. I couldn't admit to or apologize for things I didn't say, and I didn't need a husband who believed his mother's side over his own wife. Frustration brought tears to my eyes. Why had I even followed him? Seeing my distress, Thomas began to panic, but it was too late. Susan watched us with a smug smile, clearly pleased that her plan had worked. "Thomas, it's fine," I said coldly. "Next time, marry a younger, more docile daughter-in-law. You might have children then, and you'd be happier with that." Susan's words were sharp and Thomas looked lost, burying his head in his hands. Susan turned to me, saying, "Caroline, why don't you go back to your parents' house? A daughter-in-law is ultimately an outsider. I can't see you as family. You're not charming at all. So please leave quickly." Her triumphant tone stung. "I'd leave even without you telling me. I'd like to see someone who can get along with someone as twisted as you," I retorted and walked out of the restaurant. Thomas's head remained buried in his hands. Tears of frustration welled up again as I hurried away. Just as I was about to exit, I heard someone calling my name. It was Tracy and her husband. "Caroline, wait," Tracy said, clearly upset. I couldn't stand it anymore. "Mom and Nancy haven't changed at all. I knew the gossip about you was false. When I said I was cutting ties, they just told me to do whatever I wanted. I'm sorry about Thomas. He's always been a puppet for Mom and Nancy." Tracy's voice was laced with genuine concern. "My husband's job is finally settling, and we're moving soon. We've decided not to have kids," and about Nancy's side. Just then, my mobile phone rang. The caller ID showed Susan's name, and I thought, what now? As I was about to answer Susan's call, Thomas's name flashed on my phone. "What now?" I muttered. Tracy and her husband exchanged glances. "If you want, Caroline, you might want to go back to the restaurant. You might see something interesting," Tracy suggested before they left, looking satisfied. The phone kept ringing. When I finally answered, Thomas's voice was filled with panic. "Ah, Caroline, I'm sorry. I didn't realize it was a lie. The commotion in the background was chaotic. It's too late to start over now. I'll send the divorce papers later, Thomas said quickly before hanging up. I tried to end the call, but he pleaded, wait, can't you come back? Please, it's a lifetime request. Thomas's childish plea almost made me laugh, but my curiosity about Tracy's cryptic words got the better of me. I decided to return to the restaurant. When I arrived, a crowd had gathered around Thomas's table. Speaking into a microphone was Susan's favorite female announcer. The scene was chaotic. No, that's not it. We were just... It's a misunderstanding, Susan stammered, clearly struggling for the right words. Thomas and Nancy looked awkward and uneasy. The announcer, holding the microphone, directed the question to Susan. You loudly said in the restaurant that Caroline is an outsider and should leave. What did you mean by that? Please explain in detail. Tracy's husband, along with the others who had been offended, had left the scene. The whole situation seemed bizarre. I began to understand. This was turning into a spectacle on TV. As I stood there, dumbfounded, I realized I had forgotten to confirm the reservation details. A worker noticed my confusion and approached. The scene earlier had indeed been quite chaotic. It turned out there was a TV recording scheduled at the restaurant that day. Although the dining area was semi-private, conversations were easily overheard. Sorry, can I have a moment for an interview? The worker asked. Not long after I left, the famous announcer appeared with a bright smile. Susan was clearly thrilled. I'm a big fan. An interview? Absolutely, she said enthusiastically. The interview's topic was daughter-in-law and mother-in-law issues. The announcer mentioned, we heard about the heated argument earlier. The daughter-in-law left in tears. What happened? Caught off guard by this unexpected question, Susan and Nancy's faces turned pale. They were clearly unable to discuss the embarrassing truth that they had lied to drive away their son's wife. Thomas spotted me and pleaded, Caroline, please, I can't let this shame be known. It was all my misunderstanding. He looked utterly pathetic, but I had no affection left for him. I turned my attention to Susan, who smiled and said, oh, we usually call each other Carrie. Ah, Carrie, come over here. I approached silently as she beckoned. The microphone was pointed at me. You say you call each other Carrie, but how does the daughter-in-law see her mother-in-law? The announcer asked. I've never been called that, I replied. I've been called unpatriotic several times for not having children, though that's due to Thomas and me not feeling ready or confident enough to raise children. We haven't even tried for over 2 years. That's what I was always told was grounds for divorce. I recounted how Thomas had initially supported me when I first got sick and had to take leave from work. I liked his kindness and followed him here, hoping a change of environment might help. But this was the result. I had no more tears left, no more attachment to Thomas. Seeing Susan and Nancy looking embarrassed and pitiful brought me a small measure of satisfaction. I wondered if this would be broadcast nationwide. As I prepared for the broadcast and anticipated celebrating Susan's birthday, I couldn't help but reflect on what a day it had been. Seeing Susan's distressed expression, I couldn't help but smile. Well, since the daughter-in-law is considered an outsider, I guess I should leave. Goodbye, I said, savoring the moment as I exited the restaurant. Despite the shouts behind me, I walked away with a sense of satisfaction. In the end, Susan and her family managed to block the broadcast, so the footage never aired. However, the incident had gained enough attention to become the talk of the town, quickly spreading among relatives and acquaintances. After that day, I returned to my room, packed up, and went back to my parents' house. I sent the divorce papers to Thomas, but they weren't promptly returned. Considering it might be time to involve a lawyer, I was surprised when Thomas showed up at my parents' house. My father, Stephen, handled the situation with a firm demeanor. Thomas offered a heartfelt apology, saying he planned to cut ties with his family and would only believe in me from now on. But his words held little weight now. Stephen, usually a gentleman, was visibly injured. Why didn't you realize this sooner? What have you done to Carolyn all these years? Just sign the divorce papers and leave, he said sternly. Thomas, with a face full of regret, handed over the divorce papers, written in shaky handwriting. Despite the difficulty in reading them, the papers were processed successfully. It turned out that Nancy was the real cause of their infertility, though she had blamed her husband. Now close to divorce, she no longer had time to visit her in-laws. Thomas returned to his family home, living with Susan in a small town where they likely face uncomfortable rumors for a while. For me, this was all in the past. After the divorce, I reconnected with a classmate from my hometown, and we married happily. We were soon blessed with a child, and now have a 2-year-old daughter, and I'm expecting our second. My new mother-in-law is like an angel, so kind and supportive. Life is unpredictable, but right now, I'm living a happy and fulfilling life. I'm also getting married on September 10th, starting at 1 p.m. I mentioned casually. My younger sister's eyes twinkled with a mischievous glint as she smirked. Oh, same day and time, huh? What a coincidence. But you're only having a small family affair, right? I heard you're keeping it under 100 guests. That's such a shame. We're going all out, inviting everyone we know, from family to friends and colleagues. Have your little event if you must. I bit back my initial response and chose my words carefully. I'm Sarah, 30 years old, and I work full-time. I met Thomas, who's 3 years older, through a mutual friend. After dating for 2 years, we recently registered our marriage. Thomas works in the food industry and is genuinely kind and sincere. We're planning our wedding for next month, and most of the details are already in place. While many of our friends are opting for grand celebrations, we've decided to keep ours small and intimate, just with family. I prefer to avoid a mix of my parents and sister with my friends and colleagues. My parents have always favored my sister Melanie, who is 3 years younger and undeniably more attractive, something I can admit objectively. Melanie has always been their favorite, and I just wanted to avoid any awkwardness. With her striking eyes, long lashes, delicate features, and fair complexion, Melanie caught the attention of several talent agencies and worked as a teen model during her school years. My parents adored her and frequently compared her to me. Sarah, you have such a plain face. It's hard to look at you, they would say. Sarah, you lack charm. Melanie is like an angel, unlike you. They showered Melanie with new clothes and toys, indulging her every whim, while I was denied opportunities to explore hobbies. Melanie enjoyed piano, ballet, swimming, and more, but her interest was fleeting, and our parents never reprimanded her for it. Even when she failed tests due to her carefree attitude, they encouraged her, while I was harshly criticized for merely average grades. I often thought to myself, I wish you hadn't had me at all. Every time they voiced how they wished I had never been born. I wasn't allowed to respond as my parents criticized me and showered Melanie with affection. Unsurprisingly, Melanie grew up pampered and entitled, retaining her beauty but developing a cruel streak. We don't look alike at all, sis. Your plain face is so pathetic, she would taunt, constantly putting me down. I was reluctant to introduce my parents and sister to Thomas or his family, but my in-laws understood the complicated dynamics and didn't push. Still, my parents insisted on a meeting, so we arranged a joint family dinner. On the day of the dinner, I was anxious as my parents, Melanie, and Thomas's parents gathered. Distracted by the fear of any potential mishaps, I barely enjoyed the meal. Despite the occasion being about my upcoming wedding, my parents showed little interest in Thomas. When we talked about how we met or our future plans, they responded with indifference, offering only a disinterested Instead, they lavished praise on Melanie during introductions. When my in-laws tried to steer the conversation back to me, my parents would dismiss it, saying, "Forget about her, let's talk about Melanie." Melanie added, "Mom, Dad, you're praising me too much. Anyway, there's nothing interesting about sis." It was disheartening to see my dysfunctional family dynamic unfold in front of Thomas and my in-laws, their expressions growing stiffer as the evening progressed. After their meal and their focus on Melanie, my family left without offering a single congratulation for our wedding. I was stunned by their lack of acknowledgement, and while Thomas gently comforted me, I never imagined they could be this hurtful. "You've had a tough time, Sarah," my in-laws said with sincere warmth. "We know you've been through a lot. We're thrilled to have you as part of our family now. Please feel free to rely on us like you would with real parents." Their kind words touched me deeply. I expressed my gratitude and decided it was time to share something I'd been contemplating. "I'm considering having a small, intimate wedding," I began, "because as you've seen, my parents and sister can be quite unpredictable. I'm concerned about what might happen if we invite acquaintances or friends. Would it be alright if we keep the celebration to just close family?" Thomas had already agreed to this plan, and my in-laws responded with a reassuring, "Of course." I breathed a sigh of relief. With their support, it was settled that our wedding would be a small, family-only affair. However, as the date approached, I was faced with an unexpected and shocking development. I was taken aback when I received an unexpected call from my parents. "Melanie is getting married. Her fiancé is here right now. You need to come over." When I arrived, I found my parents, Melanie, and her fiancé waiting. The man looked familiar. "Nice to see you, Sarah," he said with a hint of surprise. "I didn't realize you were Melanie's sister." "I'm surprised too," I responded. His name was Ethan Matthews, and he worked for one of my company's business partners. "When Melanie mentioned your name, I thought she must be talking about a different Sarah. I never imagined you two could be related. You don't look alike at all," he said with a dismissive tone. I was familiar with Ethan's condescending attitude from work. It was clear he looked down on me because I didn't have a college degree. My parents had always insisted, "You should work instead of going to college," so I joined the company right after high school. Meanwhile, Matthews had graduated from a prestigious university and seemed to judge others based on their educational background. The thought of becoming family with someone like him was unsettling, and I felt a strong urge to leave the room as quickly as possible. "Congratulations on your wedding. I'll be taking my leave now," I said, trying to exit gracefully. But then Melanie dropped a bombshell. "We've decided to hold our wedding on the same day and at the same venue as yours," she announced, with Ethan chiming in. "Our wedding will be far grander than yours," he said, a smug smile on his face. I was left stunned, unable to respond to their shocking announcement. Our venue was a large one, capable of accommodating multiple weddings in a single day. Although I had initially preferred a smaller, more intimate setting, Thomas and my in-laws had insisted on this grand venue to make our special day even more memorable. If Melanie and Ethan were planning an extravagant celebration, this venue would be perfect for them. But scheduling their wedding to coincide with ours seemed like a deliberate act of spite. Melanie and Ethan laughed mockingly. "Look at her, she's completely frozen in shock." "Are you okay?" they taunted. I tried to stay composed and asked, "What are you talking about? What about our parents and relatives? Which wedding are they supposed to attend?" Melanie remained unshaken. "Don't worry, Dad, Mom, and all our relatives will be at mine and Ethan's wedding," she said, her expression smug. Our parents immediately began calling our relatives to invite them to Melanie's ceremony. The relatives I had seen before had always favored Melanie, and now they either wanted to avoid conflict or believed her version of events over mine. Despite my attempts to explain that Melanie had announced her wedding date only hours after ours, they dismissed my concerns, calling me immature for even suggesting a conflict. Seeing the smug expressions on my parents', Melanie's, and Ethan's faces, I sighed in resignation and said, "All right, fine." I left the house, and no one came to see me out. As I closed the door, I could hear their mocking laughter echoing behind me. Back home, I apologized to Thomas and my in-laws for not being able to invite anyone from my side to our intimate wedding, even though I had initially suggested a small guest list. They were understanding and even suggested that with fewer guests, we could make the ceremony more elaborate. I was genuinely appreciative of their support. The wedding day arrived, and as I walked through the lobby, I encountered some of Melanie's relatives heading to her reception. I overheard them whispering, "Sarah is such a nasty woman compared to Melanie. She's so plain." I tried to ignore their remarks, focusing instead on making our day as special as possible. Our ceremony went wonderfully. Thomas's talented relatives put on a series of performances that filled the venue with joy and created a truly festive atmosphere. In the midst of our celebration, a commotion erupted as Melanie, Ethan, my parents, and Ethan's parents barged into our wedding. "Melanie, what's going on?" I asked, bewildered. Melanie abruptly shouted, "Everyone from Ethan's office is missing today. You must have done something." In reality, Melanie and Ethan's reception hall was nearly empty, with many seats unfilled, causing a heated confrontation between my parents and Ethan's parents. My parents angrily criticized them. What a disgrace. Ethan's parents, taken aback and upset by the unwarranted blame, were in a foul mood. Panicked, Melanie falsely claimed to Ethan's parents that our weddings had been deliberately scheduled to overlap due to our strained relationship, leading her to storm into my ceremony, accusing me of sabotage. My wedding was a disaster, and yet Sarah's is full of joy. It's infuriating. Melanie exclaimed, her frustration evident. "Melanie, please calm down," I pleaded, trying to de-escalate the situation. But Melanie ignored me and took to the microphone, shouting, "Attention, everyone. My sister Sarah is the worst person in the world. She's been bullying me since we were children. I rushed to intervene. Melanie, stop this. But she ignored me and continued her tirade. I look so much better in a wedding dress than she does. She's always been jealous of my beauty, and she's just a gloomy, depressing person. Melanie continued, making unfounded claims. Ethan chimed in, supporting her. That's right. Sarah is just a high school graduate and completely useless, he said. He went on, that's why hiring high school graduates is a mistake. I graduated from a top university and am extremely talented. I'm even friends with the CEO, so a promotion is a sure thing. Ethan continued to boast about his achievements, adding to the tension. However, when Ethan saw my father-in-law seated at the groom's family table, his face went white. Having been so confident in his boasting and disparaging comments about me, he now trembled in fear. Why is the CEO here? He stammered in disbelief. Matthews, I'm very disappointed in you, my father-in-law said, his voice filled with anger. Why is the CEO here? Ethan asked in a panic. My father-in-law responded, I am the father of the groom. There's your father-in-law. Ethan stood there, stunned and speechless, realizing that my father-in-law was indeed the CEO of his company. The reception venues for our weddings were adjacent, and before our ceremony began, I had overheard Ethan's guests discussing how the wedding dates and times had been intentionally overlapped. Upon learning the truth, Ethan's guests had been so frightened by the CEO's anger that they had fled the scene. No, it's not what you think, sir. I had no idea. It was all Melanie's doing, Ethan pleaded desperately. Melanie looked at him incredulously. There's no way I would sabotage Sarah's wedding. She's an important client's employee. What I said earlier was just a joke. I didn't mean it, Ethan continued with a weak defense, but he was cut off by my father-in-law's stern command. Stop lying. I spoke with your colleague earlier and heard about the derogatory remarks you've made about Sarah, my father-in-law said firmly. Ethan, caught off guard and searching for an excuse, lowered his head in defeat. Sarah is an exceptional woman. She couldn't attend college due to her family's circumstances but began working right after high school and has been dedicated ever since. Despite her challenging situation at home, she has always lived with integrity and kindness. Unlike you, she would never judge or belittle someone based on their education, my father-in-law continued, his praise making me tear up. Ethan stammered, sir, I deeply apologize for, but was interrupted by my father-in-law. You're apologizing to the wrong person. Apologize to Sarah and stay out of my son and his wife's lives from now on. Understood? Yes, sir, Ethan said, trembling uncontrollably. He turned to me, tears in his eyes, and apologized. I'm truly sorry. I've had enough. Please leave, I said firmly. Melanie, bewildered, shouted, what is happening? Why is this going on? Ethan snapped at Melanie, be quiet. I regret ever marrying you. Melanie's face flushed with rage. What did you just say? She demanded. The two began to argue fiercely, and soon the venue staff arrived to escort Ethan and Melanie out. Their parents, stunned by the chaos, also quickly departed. With the disturbance gone, the remaining guests and I shook off the shock and continued the celebration. The reception resumed with a renewed energy and turned out to be an incredible event. I thanked my father-in-law, saying, Father, I was deeply touched by what you said earlier. Thank you so much. He smiled warmly and replied, I'm sorry for my subordinate's behavior. Thank you, Sarah, for marrying my son. If you ever find yourself in trouble, don't hesitate to reach out. Although Ethan was clearly anxious about facing consequences for his actions, the situation wasn't work-related, so he wasn't demoted. However, his attempts to ingratiate himself with my father-in-law in hopes of career advancement backfired spectacularly when his true character was revealed. Unable to repair his damaged reputation, Ethan could only discuss work-related matters with my father-in-law and was demoted to a lower position within the company. His previous behavior of boasting about being the boss's favorite had led to his isolation. Even his colleagues and subordinates began to avoid him, unwilling to make eye contact. By the end of the day, Ethan was likely just another employee to my father-in-law, especially since he hadn't even known who his son was marrying. News of Ethan's misdeeds quickly spread throughout the company, diminishing his comfort at work. He began to blame Melanie for everything and became violent towards her. Melanie responded by suing Ethan for domestic violence, while Ethan's parents filed a lawsuit against Melanie for ruining the wedding. The situation spiraled into a chaotic divorce drama. Melanie was distraught over Ethan's violence and the lawsuit from his parents. While Ethan and his parents claimed that Melanie and her family had interfered with Ethan's career and ruined the wedding, both sides hired lawyers and prepared for a legal battle, but they were so fixated on their own narratives that they ignored any inconvenient truths. As the conflict dragged on, Melanie quickly depleted her funds due to wedding expenses and legal fees, making life increasingly difficult after the divorce. She had to move back in with her parents who had once pampered her but now treated her with disdain, labeling her as the disgrace of the family. Although I tried to distance myself, Melanie persistently called and emailed me, detailing her hardships. Despite my efforts to ignore her, I was inundated with hundreds of missed calls and unread emails. I blocked her abusive messages and pleas for money without responding. Soon, my parents began contacting me as well, begging for financial help. Their requests were relentless and annoying, though I couldn't tell if they were trying to cover their own wedding-related expenses or hoping to sway me with their pleas. The volume of their communication grew, becoming a significant nuisance. I blocked their calls and emails too. I anticipated they might visit in person, but they clearly lacked the funds for transportation. Ethan's parents, who should have been practically strangers to me, began persistently asking me to mediate with my father-in-law. They even tried to follow me home recently. I reported their behavior immediately, but they always fled whenever the police arrived. Their attempts to stake out my home became more frequent, prompting more police reports and increased patrols. For now, things have calmed down. In the meantime, I'm creating a loving home with my kind mother-in-law and father-in-law, who I now think of as my true family. I'm experiencing the genuine warmth of a family environment, something I had only heard about before. Here, there's no trace of the daughter-in-law bullying I had previously endured, and I'm discovering what it truly means to have a supportive and affectionate family. It seemed like the labor pains had started. As a first-time mom, I was filled with anxiety, especially since I was so far from my hometown and returning for the birth wasn't an option. Thankfully, my in-laws' house was just a 10-minute walk away, and with our good relationship, I planned to rely on them if needed. My due date was yesterday, and just as my husband left for work, I started feeling what I suspected were labor pains. I had just arrived at work, but I knew the baby wouldn't arrive immediately. I decided to keep an eye on things and let my husband know if anything changed. Despite my growing anxiety, my husband George seemed strangely indifferent. Reflecting on it now, I realized his behavior had been off for a while. My name is Ellie. At 32, I'm a full-time housewife, having left my job upon discovering I was pregnant. George, who is 2 years older than me, was a senior at the university I attended. We reconnected at a university club gathering 3 years ago, and our chemistry was immediate. Given our age, we decided to marry soon after. I was thrilled to marry while still in my late 20s. George's demanding job often keeps him late or requires him to work on his days off, which only heightens my anxiety. Fortunately, my mother-in-law has been a tremendous support, especially during the rough patch of morning sickness. She's eagerly anticipating the arrival of her grandchild, and I want to ensure a healthy delivery for her sake. My father-in-law has also been incredibly helpful, driving me to the hospital when needed. I'm truly blessed with such wonderful in-laws. Yesterday was my due date, and my anxiety spiked as I noticed no signs of labor starting. I voiced my concerns to George before he left for work, but he seemed irritated and hurried. If the labor pains haven't started, it means it's not time yet. There's no point in overthinking it. The baby will come when it's ready, he said dismissively before heading out. I wasn't asking for him to do anything specific. I just wanted him to understand and empathize with my anxiety. We had this argument several times during my pregnancy, with George insisting that overthinking won't change anything and that things will work out in their own time. Maybe he's right, but giving birth feels like a matter of life and death. His indifference during my severe morning sickness and painful contractions only added to my frustration. When we first discovered I was pregnant, George was overjoyed. I vividly remember his excitement when we went shopping for baby supplies together. He was thrilled at the prospect of becoming a dad. However, as time went on, his attitude shifted. By the time I reached the stable phase of my pregnancy, he had become noticeably distant. It might have been because work was particularly demanding, but I wished he would be more attentive and caring. Despite these feelings, I've managed to get through each day. Even today, a day past my due date, George left for work with his usual demeanor. Despite my frustrations, I focused on the well-being of our baby and managed to see him off with a calm expression. About an hour later, I began experiencing what felt like labor pains. I called the hospital, but they advised me to wait since my contractions were still spaced apart. I packed my hospital bag and tried to rest while keeping an eye on the time. By the afternoon, the contractions became more frequent, so I took a taxi to the hospital. I attempted to call George, but he didn't answer, so I sent him an email before admitting myself. Since my in-laws were at work, I couldn't rely on them for support. From that point on, all I could focus on was enduring the intense pain. It was excruciating, and I felt utterly alone and anxious, nearly passing out from the discomfort several times. George finally arrived at the hospital in the evening, but to my dismay, he seemed to have been drinking. Really? Of all days? When I mentioned I was in labor, he brushed it off, saying, "I had a sudden drinking party, but I only had one beer." He seemed almost proud, as if having just one beer was something to be commended. It drove me crazy. What? Even one beer is still drinking? You reek of alcohol. Don't come near me like this. Just leave. Between the sharp belly itches and the stench of alcohol, I could hardly think straight. Fortunately, a nurse came in and promptly escorted George out, leaving me alone once more. I spent a restless night, and before I knew it, morning had arrived. It seemed the baby was about to be born soon. After moving to the delivery room and waiting for a while, George eventually came in, looking like he had sobered up. I wanted to ask, what does he want now? But I was too exhausted to even speak. Finally, my son was born safely. Despite the near overwhelming pain, I felt a profound relief when I heard my baby's healthy cry. When the nurse handed my son to George, he hesitated but took him in his arms. As I vaguely thought, so he's a dad now, George made an outrageous comment. He doesn't look like me at all. Whose kid is this? Saying that, George handed our son back to the nurse. I was stunned and glared at him, unable to make sense of what was happening. Get out, I said firmly, despite the pain making it difficult to speak. George left the room without a word. What was he thinking? How could he act like this? I was too angry and drained to dwell on his behavior, focusing instead on the situation at hand. My son was taken to the nursery, and I was moved to my room. Though I was seething, exhaustion eventually overtook me, and I fell asleep without realizing it. The days flew by as I focused on caring for my son during my 5-day hospital stay. George visited occasionally, but since we were in separate rooms, our time together was brief. My mother-in-law came to pick me up when I was discharged, while George reportedly went back to work. She seemed unaware of George's earlier behavior and showered our baby with affection, constantly remarking on how cute he was. My father-in-law, who had left work early, also came by to help. With them looking after our son, I was able to get some much-needed rest. I was deeply grateful for their support. In the evening, while my mother-in-law was preparing dinner, George came home. I greeted him with a welcome back, but he responded coldly and without warmth. As soon as he entered the living room, he pulled an envelope from his bag, completely ignoring our son. With a smirk, he called me over. "Ellie, I need to talk to you." I was already irritated by his demeanor, but what happened next was even more shocking. George pulled out some documents from the envelope and shoved them in my face. "I had it tested. The baby isn't mine, so we're getting a divorce. This proves your affair." I let out a stunned gasp, and my mother-in-law's cooking came to a halt. My father-in-law, who was holding our son, froze in disbelief, staring at George. Despite the stunned silence that filled the room, George looked utterly smug. When my son was born, I couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't resemble me at all. Out of curiosity, I decided to secretly have a DNA test done. When the results came in, George insisted we review them together. He handed me the document, which was filled with complex terminology and numbers. I zeroed in on a key sentence. The tested individual cannot be excluded as the biological father. George, cannot be excluded, means I'm the father, right? What? Do you have zero reading comprehension? George replied with a calm smirk. If you're not excluded, it means you are the father. George started to panic. What? No way. As I recalled the events of the birth, my anger flared up again. So all those accusations were because you suspected me of cheating. I vividly remembered him asking, "Whose kid is this?" when he first saw our newborn son. I placed the document in front of my in-laws, who were livid. "George, how could you do this to Ellie while she was going through so much?" They scolded him. As his parents reprimanded him, George began to make excuses. "Well, the office is full of men, and she often went to drinking parties. She came home late some nights, so naturally, I was concerned. I felt a surge of irritation at George as he glanced at me while speaking. I reported every drinking party to you, and you even picked me up when I was going to be late, and still, you doubted me." But George continued to act as if he were in the right. "Well, I've read about people raising their partner's child on the internet. A coworker suggested I get a DNA test." "Oh, I see. There's probably no point in discussing this further with him," I thought. "Really? You trusted random stories and the advice of a stranger over me?" My anger flared. "I endured morning sickness and a grueling labor to give birth to a healthy child for you, George, and this is how you repay me." My mother-in-law started to cry, and my father-in-law was visibly enraged. "I can't believe this," he said. As I angrily knocked the documents from George's hand, he fumbled to pick them up, accidentally dropping his bag. To my shock, something unexpected fell out. "What's this?" Inside George's bag was a divorce form. "Are you planning to divorce me suddenly?" George's earlier confidence vanished, leaving him flustered. "No, this isn't, I could no longer tolerate his behavior. You've gone through the effort of preparing divorce papers, and now you're saying you don't want to divorce." I grabbed the divorce papers and tightly gripped a pen. As I prepared to sign, George tried to stop me, but just then, his smartphone rang with an incoming email. My hand paused, a sinking feeling washing over me. When had his behavior and words started to seem so off? It had been strange since summer, after spring had passed. What was this unease? Driven by impulse, I snatched George's phone, holding it away from him as he panicked. I unlocked the screen and was shocked by what I saw. I read aloud. "Have you filled out the divorce papers yet? It wasn't your child anyway, right? Claim alimony from your wife and let's go on a lavish trip." What's this? My intuition had been right. I was puzzled by your sudden accusations of cheating and wondered where they came from. Could it be that you're the one who's been unfaithful? That's why you suspected me of cheating, isn't it? George's face went pale. Who is this woman? Could she be a new employee or something? You must have become the point of contact for new hires this spring and got close to her. I continued calmly. That makes sense. Your behavior changed because you were cheating on me. That's why you were coming home late and claiming to work on holidays. Probably just going on dates. Seeing that George remained silent, it seemed my assumptions were hitting close to home. Hearing this, my father-in-law's anger flared up again. Is this true? As George avoided eye contact, my father-in-law's fist connected with his face. Turning to me, my father-in-law bowed deeply. "Ellie, I'm truly sorry for my foolish son." George, now bowing alongside his father, was subjected to a stern interrogation. "You should be the one apologizing. Tell the whole truth." The woman George had been involved with matched my suspicions. She was a younger employee who had transferred from another branch, and since George was responsible for her training, their affair had developed from there. It turned out she was also married, though she didn't have children. Stunned, I quickly completed the divorce papers and thrust them at George. "Sign these immediately." "Ellie, I'm sorry. Please reconsider. I admit my mistakes," George pleaded. I could only regard him with cold detachment. "No, I won't reconsider. I don't need someone who abandons me in my time of need. I don't want to see your face again. Since you doubted our son's paternity, you don't need to be a part of his life either. However, I will be seeking child support." With my father-in-law as a witness, George filled out the divorce papers. We also discussed alimony and child support. During this time, my mother-in-law, who had taken our son away temporarily, returned. She silently handed something to George. Confused, he opened it to find an old photo album. Inside was a picture of a baby who bore a striking resemblance to our son. "It looks just like him. There's no way he's not your child," my mother-in-law said coldly. "These are pictures from when George was born. He resembles our son exactly." George's shock was evident, but he doesn't look anything like me. He began to make excuses. At that point, my patience snapped. If a newborn baby looked exactly like you as an adult, wouldn't that be unsettling? Clearly from the photo, it's obvious that this child is yours. "No, it's not that. It's just that everyone kept saying it. I believed it from the start," George stammered. "Liar. If you truly believed it, you wouldn't have demanded a DNA test. You're always shifting the blame. Take responsibility for your actions. You neglected your pregnant wife and had an affair. That's a fact. And now you're letting your mistress sway you, ducking your wife, and conducting a DNA test on your own child. Is there any sincerity in any of this? No. I was suffering while you were unfaithful. I'm not so generous as to forgive such betrayal. I let loose on George without pausing for breath. Despite his constant apologies, I couldn't find it in me to forgive him, and we proceeded with the divorce. The rumors about George's affairs quickly spread at work, making his job increasingly difficult and leading to a series of mistakes. Consequently, he was transferred to a different branch in Nebraska. I considered moving back to my parents' house, but given the challenges of traveling long distances postpartum, I decided to stay in George's now empty family home. My son is growing up healthy here, and I'm settling in well. George's parents gave him a severe reprimand, and he's been using his savings to pay alimony, closely monitored by my father-in-law. He makes his payments every month. We also pursued damages from the woman he had the affair with. Her husband discovered the betrayal, leading to their divorce. I heard she's now working at a bar. Though George was a foolish husband, I am deeply grateful for the support of my in-laws. They've been a strong presence in my life as I raise our son. I'm very satisfied with the way things have turned out. At 34, I'm still living at my childhood home with my mother. It's been 3 years since my father passed away, and I decided to stay here because I didn't want to leave her alone. During these years, we had unwelcome visitors, my brother Bob and his wife Jane. I've known Bob since his birth, and Jane, his middle school classmate, has been around almost as long. They've been a couple since then, and Bob would bring Jane home for vacations, so I got to know her quite well. To put it plainly, they've left a lasting impression on me, and not a good one. They used to bully me for fun. Our parents, both busy with their careers, were often away on weekends, and that's when Bob and Jane's torment would peak. We lived in a large mansion built by my father, a CEO. During those unsupervised times, Bob and Jane would trick me into playing hide and seek, only to trap me in a closet. They would cram it with stuff, making it impossible for me to get out. I'd be stuck there until just before our parents came home, and then I'd be punished for the mess in the closet. One day, my mother came home early and caught Bob and Jane in the act. She was furious, and after that, I was never locked in the closet again. However, the harassment didn't stop. I resented my parents for their absence and felt a deep-seated anger towards Bob and Jane. But as I grew older, my resentment also extended to my parents for not stepping in sooner. By middle school, their cruelty escalated. Bob and Jane shredded my school uniform, defaced nearly all my textbooks, and destroyed my cushions and bedding. Their relentless torment was a painful reminder of how little support I had received growing up. Later, I discovered that Bob and Jane, who were high school students at the time, had performed poorly on their final exams and had been scolded by their parents. It seemed that their anger and frustration had fueled their cruel revenge on me. I was left stunned in my devastated room, overwhelmed with questions. Why was I enduring this? Why was no one coming to my aid? I stood there, lost in these thoughts, until my mother came to call me for dinner. When she saw the state of my room, she screamed in horror. My father rushed in as well. Bob, the last to arrive, struggled to contain his laughter, occasionally letting out a chuckle. Confronted by my shocked parents, I cried out, "Mom, Dad, I want to leave this house." Tears streamed down my face as I continued, "No one is helping me. Bob and Jane are always so mean. My toys, my study materials, my clothes, they're all ruined. I don't want to live like this anymore. I hate both of you. You're not helping me." It was the first time I had cried so openly in front of my family. Until that moment, I had silently endured and wept quietly in my struggles. But now, I sobbed loudly like a child. Seeing my distress, my mother hugged me tightly, apologizing for everything that had happened. Even Bob, witnessing the severity of the situation, appeared to understand the gravity and tried to leave. But my father stopped him by grabbing him by the collar. "Do you realize what you've done? This is criminal," my father said, his voice low but filled with intensity. Bob protested, "Oh, come on, it's just an exaggeration. We were only playing around." "Destruction of property is a crime," my father retorted. "You understand you need to make amends, right?" "But Catherine is family," Bob argued weakly. Bob's attempt to downplay his actions with, I'm a minor. Minors can't be criminals, right? Was met with a deep sigh from my father. Yes, a minor like you might not be able to pay for the damage, my father said, but it's up to the parents to address the consequences. If you can't make amends, we will have to. We also bear responsibility for raising you this way. I think it's time for you to go live with your uncle. My uncle, my father's younger brother, was a stern figure who had a reputation for disliking dishonesty. He was feared by the neighborhood kids, almost like a boogeyman. He was kind to well-behaved children, including me, but had no patience for troublemakers like Bob and Jane. Bob, of course, was terrified of the idea. No way, I don't want to live with Uncle. I promise I won't do this again. My father's voice was resolute. You've made that promise before. When you and Jane locked Catherine in the closet, chased her around, and threw bugs at her knowing she's afraid of them, each time you promised to change. But you never did. He continued, we cannot keep someone who hurts our family, even if they are family. Never set foot in this house again. With that, my father grabbed Bob by the scruff of his neck and dragged him out. Later, I learned that my parents had been deeply upset by Bob's behavior. Despite their scolding, Bob still didn't seem to grasp why he was being punished. Bob continued his annoying antics against me, and I began to think he was beyond help. It seemed there were people in the world who couldn't grasp even the basic rules of society, and Bob and Jane were prime examples. Initially, Bob had planned to attend university on our father's dime after finishing high school. But my father told him that someone like Bob would likely end up causing trouble even in university. As a result, Bob ended up working at our uncle's company right after graduation. It became clear that Bob was desperate to escape our uncle's rigid environment. Shortly after high school, he and Jane, who had also just graduated, rented an apartment together. They began their new life with the understanding that neither their parents nor their uncle would help with rent or living expenses. Soon after moving out, Bob asked me to lend him some money. At the time, I had just started high school and wasn't working part-time. The money I had saved up, which Bob had previously stolen when he lived at home, had been fully reimbursed by my parents as I had documented everything meticulously in a notebook. Although I had the money, I had no intention of giving it to him. I told Bob, aren't you ashamed to ask your high school-aged sister for money? I'm not even working, so I don't have any extra funds. There's no way I'm giving you any. After that, I informed both my mother and father about Bob's request for money. They were furious and vowed not to provide any further assistance. I felt it was best for Bob and Jane to fend for themselves without relying on others. Since then, I focused on my studies and worked hard to go to college. I dedicated myself to my studies throughout college and, after graduation, joined a company where I continued to grow and learn. My busy life made me completely forget about Bob. That is, until an invitation to his wedding arrived at our house. I saw that Jane, with whom Bob had been living, was the bride. I thought, so they're finally getting married. My parents and I discussed whether we should attend the wedding of a family member. However, just a few days before the wedding, my father collapsed and was rushed to the hospital. He had always been fragile, but this was the first time he had collapsed so severely. Both my mother and I were frantic and immediately called for an ambulance. In the midst of the chaos, I reached out to Bob, only to be met with a dismissive response. I'm about to get married. Don't call me during this crucial period of my bachelorhood, he said. When I informed him of our father's emergency hospitalization, he shrugged it off, saying, he just tripped, didn't he? Make sure to come to my wedding. And with that, he hung up. Shortly after, our father passed away. With both the wake and funeral inevitable, my mother and I had to inform Bob that we wouldn't be able to attend his wedding. Despite his insistence that we come, we decided to stay home. We also informed Jane's parents about our father's passing and our inability to attend the wedding. While Jane's parents understood our situation, Bob and Jane criticized us for not coming, calling our absence disrespectful. The messages left on my mother's and my voicemail were so absurd that it made me question who the real rude ones were. Bob and Jane accused us of being disrespectful, claiming that we were trying to ruin their wedding, despite all the effort we had put into it. While my mother and I were occupied with arranging the funeral, Bob and Jane proceeded with their wedding as if our father's death was an afterthought. After that, my mother and I chose not to discuss the situation further, but it was clear that our relationship with my brother had been irrevocably damaged. Then, unexpectedly, Bob showed up at our doorstep. When I answered the intercom and heard, "I've got a delivery," I was taken aback to see Bob and Jane standing there. The monitor had only shown their silhouettes, so I was unprepared for their arrival. As soon as I opened the door, they barged in with large pieces of luggage, pushing me aside. Hey, what's the rush? I protested. It seemed Bob had completely ignored our father's final command to never set foot in our house again. Bob and Jane rudely entered, dumped their luggage in the hallway, and began speaking to me without any regard for decency. You and Mom need to leave this house immediately, Bob declared. What? I responded, shocked. Isn't Mom diagnosed with dementia? This mansion isn't suited for someone like her or a loser like you who never improves, Bob continued. A place like this should belong to glamorous people like Jane and me. So you need to get out right away. I was stunned. What on earth was my brother talking about? After 3 years since our father's death, he hadn't offered an apology, visited the grave, or made any effort to mend things. And now he was demanding the mansion. To make matters worse, he presumed her mother had dementia and was planning to evict her. I was left speechless. Just then, our mother emerged from a room at the back. Catherine, what's going on? She asked, her confusion evident. When she saw my brother and Jane, she said something that left me even more bewildered. Oh, who might you be? If you're a stranger, please leave, she said. Bob and Jane burst into mocking laughter. See, Bob said, this is how she acts every time we call her. Her dementia must be getting worse. I'll leave it to you to take care of Mom, Bob said dismissively. You can have her. I'll take the mansion. After all, I'm the eldest son, so it's only right that I get the mansion. With that, Bob strode deeper into the house. Jane, mimicking Bob's demeanor, turned to me and our mother, saying, Take the old lady and get out. I never want to see you again. I rushed to my mother's side, asking, Mom, are you okay? Feeling as though we were being forcibly evicted, my mother and I left the mansion, abandoning all the old furniture behind. We gathered our personal belongings and fled the house. Fortunately, a friend of mine, who was abroad and unable to manage his house, offered it to us. His cousin had been looking after it, but with his imminent transfer to another state next year, it seemed like perfect timing for us to use it. When we arrived at the house and set down our luggage, a sense of relief washed over us. We took a moment to breathe deeply and relax. Then my mother said with a hint of humor, We've left that house, and I still can't stand how Bob and Jane acted. Maybe we should just sell it. I took the opportunity to ask the question that had been on my mind. Bob said you have dementia, Mom. What's that about? Oh, that, she said, her tone reflective. About 2 years ago, Bob and Jane began frequently asking me for money. They didn't attend their father's funeral or contact me afterward. I was baffled by their nerve to ask for money after treating me so poorly. So every time they called, I pretended not to recognize them and said, Who? I don't know you. You're a stranger to me, right? It seemed Bob and Jane misunderstood my mother's indifference. They interpreted her treatment of them as forgetting who they were, assuming she genuinely had dementia because she no longer wanted anything to do with them. Regardless, I felt it was wrong to evict someone you believe has dementia. My mother quickly decided to move forward with selling the mansion. We had discussed selling the large mansion ever since our father passed away, and we were left living there alone. At that time, one of the executives from my father's company, where I am currently undergoing training as a successor, had expressed interest in buying the mansion if we decided to sell. So the buyer was essentially confirmed. We just needed to handle the formalities. When I spoke with a real estate acquaintance and explained the situation to the executive, they agreed that if we left Bob and Jane alone, the house could fall into serious disrepair. Something needed to be done quickly. A week later, my smartphone rang incessantly, and my mother's phone was also blowing up. There were numerous calls from Bob to my mother's phone and from Jane to mine. They probably wanted to discuss the same issue, but we found their attempts amusing and chose to ignore them for a while. We enjoyed our tea and chatted, letting an hour pass without noticing. It seemed Bob and Jane had been trying to reach us the entire time. When I finally answered the call, Jane exclaimed, Finally, why didn't you pick up sooner? There's a huge problem. The house has been taken over. Wait a minute, I said. Didn't you two take over the house? I think we're the ones who should be saying we've been taken over. No, Jane said, sounding panicked. Bob and I took over the mansion, but now strangers have come and are demanding we leave. They've barged in and are trying to kick us out. Our mansion has been taken over. I couldn't help but burst out laughing. I was tempted to tell her that they were the ones who had unlawfully occupied the house in the first place. Chuckling, I replied, "You're talking about being taken over, but you're not even the legal owners. My mother, the rightful owner, sold the house to someone else. So the strangers you're talking about are the new owners, and you need to move out." "What?" "She sold it. But this mansion belongs to Bob." Jane was in shock. "When did anyone say that?" "Well, no one explicitly said it," I answered, "but Bob is the eldest son. Isn't it assumed that this house, along with the property and the company, would eventually be his? And that Jane would live elegantly as the CEO's wife in this mansion?" Despite everything, Jane was frantic and struggled to grasp the situation. I burst out laughing again. The fact that Jane thought Bob would automatically inherit the mansion and become the CEO of the company just because he was the eldest son was astonishing. Such naive thinking. Given Jane's firm belief, Bob likely shared the same misguided expectations about inheriting both the mansion and the company, despite no one ever promising him either. I laughed again at her absurd assumptions. "Bob as a CEO? You as the CEO's wife? How could you even entertain such fantasies? You're both still low-level employees at the company where you first started without any plans or education to succeed in the business." Jane was clearly taken aback by my words. Stunned, she retorted, "In that case, I'll just inherit the company from Uncle." I laughed even harder. "You should at least check the company's personnel announcements. My uncle's cousin's son became the president last month." "What?" Jane was in disbelief. "So there's no chance for Bob to become CEO, and I can't be the CEO's wife?" "That's correct," I confirmed. "Can I hang up now? I don't think I need to talk to strangers anymore." "Wait, please, Catherine, give us some money," Jane pleaded. "Well, goodbye then," I said, ending the call. Later, I heard from my uncle about what happened next. Bob and Jane refused to leave the mansion, clinging to the pillars and stubbornly refusing to go. My uncle had to come and pick them up himself. It seems their strict training at my uncle's company had scared them so much that they cried when he took them away. They were placed at a mountain retreat owned by one of my uncle's acquaintances because they proved too unpredictable to be left on their own. My uncle warned them that if they didn't improve at the retreat, they might never leave the mountain. Despite this warning, they attempted to escape multiple times but were caught each time. As for me, the person handling the house management is my fiancé, who is currently working abroad. I'm living in his parents' house while he completes his long-term assignment. He plans to end his assignment this year and will soon be planning our wedding. My mother and uncle, who have helped us so much, will be invited to the wedding, but of course, Bob and Jane will not.